Tips from Trestle, the Senior Living Food and Hospitality podcast, is brought to you by eMenu Choice Point of Sale and Clark Pro. Welcome to Tips from Trestle, the Senior Living Food and Hospitality podcast. This podcast explores the senior living industry with a unique focus on food, hospitality, and the community experience. I'm your host, Aaron Fish. My goal for this podcast: educate, inform, and inspire leaders in senior living. How? By bringing the resident and customer experience to the front of mind in our industry. We should bring the passionate spirit of food and hospitality to everything that we do and everyone we serve each and every day. So what are we waiting for? Let's get to it. Today on Tips from Trestle, I'm talking with Kevin Berg. Kevin boasts an impressive 21-year tenure in the food service industry, marked by a diverse range of roles and responsibilities. His culinary journey began in the kitchen, where he ascended from line cook to executive chef over a decade. Transitioning to broadline food sales, Kevin discovered Clark Associates and joined Clark Pro 9 years ago. Since then, he has been an integral part of the account management team, managing some of the company's largest partners. Currently, Kevin focuses on the onboarding and training of the sales and account management team, while also coordinating ongoing learning opportunities for Clark Pro. Kevin, thanks for joining me today on Tips from Trestle.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so there's so many different things that I know when we were prepping that we could talk about. But I think one of the areas that I wanted to get into your background and your expertise on was talking about renovations for senior living operators. We're in a market that new builds are still happening. We know it's a growing industry, but there's a ton of opportunity and a lot of projects that are coming even my way with what I do around renovating an existing property to make it meet the market better. And so when you think about all the different projects and the different things that Clark Pro works on in this area, I'd love to kind of start with what are some of the challenges you see operators face when they're looking at doing kitchen renovations?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times, if you're looking at a renovation project, they might be starting out from a position of minor frustration because they thought they were going to get a whole new build, and now they're backtracking for budgetary reasons, and they're going into renovation. That brings up its own headaches and stuff. But it's in terms of the renovations, the concerns are going to be making sure that we get the right equipment for you and your specific situation and your kitchen and your operations needs. It's never as simple as like, hey, we have an 8-foot hood and we need to fit this, this, and this underneath it. It
Right.
needs much more, ideally, it should be much more considered and thought out and tailored to the specific location.
Yeah. One of the things that I've come across in some of these projects is that a lot of times you're dealing with buildings that are 20, 25, 30 years old. The bones of the building are still good. The bones of the kitchen are still good. But this kitchen was designed for a 1995, 2000 like operational mindset, right? And an operational approach. And we definitely don't operate the same way now as we did then. And so what are some of the things that operators should be thinking about as they start to plan for this kitchen renovation around upgrading equipment during the process?
Yeah, personally, I'm a big fan of versatility in pieces of equipment. So, touching on what you mentioned with like the operational sort of environment versus more contemporary, more modern approaches to feeding your populations. The standard example that we refer to a lot internally is the old fashioned steamer, the upright 12-pan steamer
Yeah.
that costs an inordinate amount of money. They're very expensive. They're very difficult to maintain. And they do one thing and they just do that one thing. They don't do anything else. With current trends with equipment, there are now multiple pieces of equipment that can do the same thing that the steamer does, but better and at the same price point, and then can do 50 other things on top of that. So obviously I'm kind of talking about combi ovens. I get made fun of for talking about combi ovens a lot because I think they're pretty amazing. But yeah, I mean, a 12-pan steamer is going to run upwards of $20,000 at this point. A couple of 6-pan half size combi ovens stacked will run in the same ballpark, and there's no chance of it catching on fire if you forget to delime it, because it will just say no, you can't cook anymore. So that's a perfect example, and I think that's a really good illustrator of kind of the change from single stodgy pieces of equipment that do one thing into other more modern efficient pieces of equipment that can do many things.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned there that I always kind of think about when I think about my time in a large CCRC kitchen way back in the day to some of the kitchens that I'm in and working in now, the these massive bulk prep pieces of equipment. Do you find with renovation projects that even your example of the 12-pan to 6-pan combis, is that like one for one always necessary? Would an operator who probably would they be able to get away with that single 6-pan combi oven if they've taken this approach of more all a menu cooking and a more focused menu and batch cooking in their operation?
Absolutely. That's kind of like the key selling point for that. It's replacing multiple pieces of equipment in theory. But yeah, you can probably, depending on your workload and your volume, you could probably, and your staffing, you may or may not be able to get away with a smaller 6-pan unit or something like that. There's definitely opportunities to consolidate. But to your point, we definitely see a decrease in the bulk, the really huge batch cooking. It's moved. All of your listeners, I'm sure, are well aware that it's no longer the days of like one institutional type kitchen producing one thing that day, and that's what people eat. I'm not even an expert in your part of the world in senior living specifically, but I know that the kind of individual cafe or restaurant concept or the satellite kitchens or country kitchens have become much more of the dominant mode of doing things. And they inevitably are producing smaller batches. Not as many people have the 40-gallon tilt skillet in the back anymore. Like, we still sell them, but not as often. And they tend to be smaller because the batches are smaller, and everybody's preferences have gotten more and more specific over the years. And you folks have to accommodate all those things as you get a new generation moving in. And yeah, it's a
Yeah.
lot.
No, I remember walking into a new acquisition and it was 100 in I want to say 110 units, maybe it was 105 units. It was around that 100 number, right? So we're talking a population of maybe 115 residents when they were
Mhm.
100%. And they had two 20-quart steam jacketed kettles. And I'm like, when are they ever going to use these? Because there's not enough people, right, for these pieces of equipment. And I think it goes back to that old way of thinking, old kind of design. And so, which lends me to want to ask you about the conversation at the start of a renovation project with the client, right? How do you go about having that conversation of, all right, we're doing this renovation project, but your market is different, who you're serving is different. How do you guys kind of manage is the wrong word, but how do you tailor your approach to that conversation to make it be a successful project in the long run?
I mean, one thing that we definitely try to do up front is make sure that we actually know the customer that we're speaking with and make sure that we are addressing their specific operation. It sounds like a simple, silly thing to point out, but kind of touching on a theme that you've already gotten to, it's not really a one size fits all sort of thing anymore. And it can be tempting to just kind of stick with everything that you've done in the past. So we want to make sure that from both the sales and account management side of things, that we know the customer, we know the project, and we know their concerns and priorities. Usually, as long as we know that, their style of serving, how many people they're serving, all that kind of stuff. If we have a better idea about that stuff, then we can kind of start steering the conversation where we would like it to go. But even with that, we typically will have them start out with like a list of equipment that they had previously. So
Mm.
that is kind of our first opportunity to kind of take a look at that equipment list first and say, okay, this makes sense. That doesn't make sense. Or to your example, why do you possibly want two 40-gallon steam kettles? We could look at potential options like that. So yeah, that gives us an opportunity to take a look at what you were doing before, see if there are any options or opportunities for us to give additional feedback. And also some people don't want feedback like from us, or like
Right.
that from us. Some people just want to get the equipment and move on. Others, we can definitely typically have a more consultative relationship with. They can lean on us for specing equipment rather than just fulfilling the orders. But yeah, it's definitely we want it to be a conversation, and we need to know the customer's priorities first.
Yeah. One of the things that I think would come up in that conversation is efficiencies, right? We think about we're looking for how can we do things more efficient financially. And so that goes into not just maybe labor, because that's a big piece of it, but we look at equipment efficiency, layout efficiency. And so what are some tips, I guess, would be, or things that you've seen in successful projects where efficiencies were implemented as you're doing the project or as you're planning the project?
Technology continues to drive changes in senior care, and that includes food service. eMenu Choice is an award-winning point-of-service application for managing the dining function in senior living communities. This mobile, touchscreen-enabled software enhances the dining experience for residents while streamlining processes for staff. The flexibility and functionality of eMenu Choice makes it an effective solution for any type of senior living environment, from independent and assisted living to skilled nursing facilities. It works for production kitchens or restaurant-style service with options for per meal or a la carte pricing, and accommodates a variety of payments, including bill to account, meal credits, and credit cards. Created by a senior care provider with more than a century of experience serving older adults, eMenu Choice eliminates communication barriers between staff and residents while enabling person-centered choices and greater resident satisfaction. eMenu Choice, transforming dining for senior living.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot there. From the equipment side of things, there's a ton of improvements in the efficiency, just like there is in every other piece of machinery or equipment in the world. But some of the bigger ones that I've seen are pieces of equipment that are able to be used without being under a hood. So ventless equipment in one form or another. That kind of touches on what you were mentioning in terms of like layout flexibility. You can't just add on a few feet to the hood if you want to stick something else underneath it. So having some of these ventless options, that can go a long way in easing some of that pain and limited real estate you might have under the hood. And when I say ventless, it started out maybe 5, 6 years ago. There was one convection oven that offered a ventless hood that you could stack on top of it. And it was extraordinarily expensive. And I don't think we sold one. And then through successive iterations of that, they've gotten less expensive. Now more equipment has things like that you can add on. So that'll go for things like convection ovens, combi ovens, things along those lines. Ventless hood systems are another option. Those are kind of a last resort for when you need something like that. You need a hood space, but better to go with ventless, in my opinion. It's just easier and cleaner.
Yeah.
Things like rapid cook, high speed ovens have definitely started making an imprint. I'm sure you're familiar with them, but for anybody not, they're like the machines that if you go to Starbucks and order your egg bites, they pop it into a machine. It comes out in 45 seconds and it's hot. That's the Turbo Chef, Mary Chefs of the world.
Yeah.
They're all ventless. They're really fast. They've cut labor time down quite a bit. Those are all good examples of that, I think.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of those. I remember my very first experience with I believe it was a Turbo Chef model where I had a frozen, I don't think it was a 5 ounce salmon fillet. It was frozen. And in about 2 minutes total cooking time, we had like not just like a cooked piece of salmon, but like it was cooked and it had a little bit of a sear on the top of it. I mean, I could not believe what I saw when I saw that. And that was a few years ago. So you can only imagine the beauty of that. One of
Yeah.
the things though about a piece of equipment like that, and some of these that you've mentioned, is the labor component. A lot of times when we would think about this push towards a more a la minute approach of having a lot of choices and variety and cooking things to order for our residents, you know, an old school chef might be thinking, I got to have a bunch of people in the kitchen. I need a bunch of bodies because that's going to be a lot of work to execute. So, how can some of these pieces of equipment impact that labor piece? Because we know that that's a huge struggle, not just necessarily finding people, but also the current wages that we're having to pay for those individuals.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. All the type of equipment that we were mentioning there, they're all helpful in terms of labor in a couple of ways. For just looking about the controls in general for that kind of equipment, these are extremely programmable machines, which means in an old school brigade system, in a traditional kitchen, you're going to have multiple experts in various things, multiple levels. And just, obviously we all know that's not particularly feasible these days. You don't have a saucier or somebody to make your grilled vegetables or whatever. But with the programmability and the flexibility of these things, you don't have to have as many experts on your staff. You can have a couple people who know how to actually develop a recipe, program it into the machine, and then lock it and hit the button. And then that avoids a couple of things. That avoids the need for ultra highly trained staff who is an expert in what they're doing. That allows you to kind of go with a slightly more junior workforce in that case, but it also gives you the control to know that they are following the process and your recipes to the letter because they don't have the option of changing it. They just hit the button that says chicken sandwich or whatever. So those things have been really helpful. And that goes for a lot of equipment, not just the rapid cook type things.
Yeah. When I think about some of the special needs of a senior living operator, because in my mind, and this is how I've always pictured a senior living kitchen, is that it straddles two worlds, right? It straddles on one side, you've got the restaurant industry where it is this like high level, high service, high quality expectation from what you're producing and how those processes work. And then you've got the institutional healthcare side where you are doing a high volume and you've got to take into consideration some of those healthcare things. And so when we're thinking about renovating the senior living kitchen, what do you think are some unique challenges that an operator of senior living might face as opposed to some of the other clients that you've worked with?
I think your population, just to start off with, is a major difference. Like you're necessarily already starting with a population that you have to take greater care and caution and go to extra lengths. So you probably don't have a kitchen that's just turning and burning, just like you might in some high volume restaurant, because you have to measure things and be much more specific for that institutional healthcare side of things. Then you also have like the a la carte room service type approach
Mm.
where you have to be able to do both at the same time. So again, I think that touches on the versatility and flexibility, like we looked at before, like a single task item is not going to be as useful in that kind of case. And those other types of operations, because they're able to have a more narrow focus, they don't have to do two different styles of service. They don't have to have the flexibility. You could potentially buy just a few main pieces of equipment and plow forward and bang out hundreds of covers in a day. But where you or one of your operators or people in your world, you have two totally different worlds happening simultaneously in the same space. So in my mind, prep space and versatility is the main hurdle for senior living.
Yeah, one thing we haven't talked about is, and I think this gets overlooked a ton when not just talking about renovations, but I think with any sort of kitchen equipment selection in general, is the utility usage, right? Thinking water, electricity, gas. These are areas that I think I know is in my 20 plus years in senior living, those were never conversations that we had around design, development, any of that, because it just wasn't something that was talked about. It was, let's get the right plan, let's get the right layout, let's get the right flow. But when you're doing a renovation, I feel like there's a huge opportunity there for some cost savings. And so where are some of those advantages when you're looking at equipment selection, when you're looking at upgrading equipment? What have you seen? What are some examples of successful upgrades that take advantage of utility efficiency?
Yeah. So there's been a huge push with the energy compliance, Energy Star regulations, and all that sort of stuff. Depending on what state people are in, they're running into a lot more of these regulations. So, like you mentioned, historically, people don't really care about the utility usage, but we've kind of hit a point where we're being forced to care because if you live in, say, New York or Vermont, Rhode Island, California, I'm literally not even allowed to ship you a fryer that's not Energy Star certified. So
Mm.
whether you like it or not, you're being kind of pulled along with energy efficiency. But yeah, and it sometimes it can be difficult to sell or get a customer to go with something that's more efficient if it's more expensive because they're not coming out of the same budget. You're not looking at it at the same level in terms of your finances. And in your mind, you're paying for the piece of equipment, you're moving on and you're feeding people. But yeah, I mean, it's at the operational level, the savings are tremendous from like energy recovery devices that some things like dishwashers have. A lot of the more modern dishwashers, instead of just dumping 6 gallons of 180-degree water every time, it's kind of recycling some of the water, separating like the wastewater from reusable water. Some of them even have like steam collection systems where your final high temp rinse has to be 180 degrees. That creates a lot of steam, obviously. And the steam collection system actually forces it to condense. It all drops down into the bottom, and then the machine keeps reusing that water rather than just dumping out big clouds of steam. So that's a huge savings in terms of that. Fryers are a great example because the traditional fryer is probably the simplest piece of equipment possible. It's a pot that you're blasting fire at and it makes it hot. Obviously, that's a horrifically wasteful way of making things hot.
Yeah.
Uh, so now like the more efficient fryers are doing things like saving oil use quantities vastly. A lot of them will have features now where you literally just hit one button and it'll drop the oil, filter it and bring it back up. So if you can filter your oil 5 times in one day instead of once at the end of the day, you're getting better life out of it. You're extending the life of that. With the way that oil prices have gone, they've been horrible lately. They're pretty appalling. So any place people can save on that is pretty great. Electric and water usage, people don't seem to notice as much, but something that they're paying for on a daily basis when they see like oil that's a good example to point out the efficiency.
Yeah. When I guess the other piece of the puzzle is the hard work, I guess if it even it could be called hard work of showing the ROI of those types of systems. I assume that's a pretty easy process for you guys. You've probably got that down to be able to say to an operator, "Hey, yeah, you may be paying an extra $2,000 for this piece of equipment, but in 8, 10, 12 months, whatever the number might be, here's what you're gonna save on the fuel or the electricity or the water." And I gotta think that those conversations for the right operators who are kind of forward thinking really are hitting home for them.
Definitely. The manufacturers of all this equipment are usually kind enough to do some of that math for us and share those stats. So we typically will have those handy. The problem we run into is customers are often a little skeptical of those
Right.
figures. If the customer's in the right mindset and they really are concerned about that, then that is the right way to go. We wouldn't try to push it hard if somebody's not interested in going with the more modern piece and they want to go with something that's more tried and true. That's a perfectly viable approach. And as long as the people cooking at the end of the day are happy, you know, we're happy too. So if customers happy, we're happy. But we definitely try to kind of it feels condescending to say we would try to educate the user about those things, but sometimes we are because we understand that someone in a director role might have come from a nutrition or a dietitian background. They might not know or frankly care about the kind of stuff that we're worrying about. So we try to do some of that legwork on your behalf so you don't have to really worry about that stuff as much. But yeah, the return on investment in terms of output, efficiency, utility usage, those are great pieces to have in your back pocket if you're having the conversation with the right operator.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, as we wrap up here, this has been a great conversation. I'm always fascinated. Design is something that I didn't think I would do early on in my career, but I kind of got into it as I grew, and it's just a kind of a fun, fascinating topic for me. And so I appreciate your insights. If anyone wants to maybe pick your brain more or learn more about how Clark Pro can support them in their renovation project, how can they connect with you?
You can reach me at kberg@clarkpro.com. Uh, and I can connect anyone with any resources within the Clark universe that they might need. And I'll be here and happy to answer any questions.
Perfect. Well, Kevin, thanks again for your insights on this. And thanks again for joining me on Tips from Trestle today.
Of course. Thanks so much for having us.
So there it is, everybody. Another one in the books. Thanks again for tuning in. Please follow, like, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media at Tips from Trestle. You can also learn more about the work I do by following me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. And be sure to check out Trestle Hospitality Concepts at www.trestle. I'm your host, Aaron Fish, and this has been another episode of Tips from Trestle.